Good evening and welcome to Book Passages Conversations with Authors. I'm your host, Paula Farmer. We know that you have plenty of options as far as online events with authors discussing books, and also in store now. A lot are doing both. And we don't take that for granted that you choose us and support Book Passage and our wonderful array of authors. Because of that, we strive to keep our standards very high with only the best of writers and books to present and discuss. Tonight is no exception. With the Book of Goose by celebrated author Yiyun Li. It is a magnificent, beguiling tale winding from rural provinces of Paris and from English boarding schools to the quiet Pennsylvania home where a woman can live without her past. I mean, we're going all over the map here, folks, and it does it in a beautiful, compelling way. Yiyun Li is the author of 6 works of fiction, including Must I Go and Where Reasons End. She is the recipient of many awards, so I'm not going to list them all, but it does include the Penn Hemingway Award, and she was featured in the New Yorker's 20 Under 40 fiction issue. Her work has also appeared in A Public Space and the Best American Short Stories, among many other publications. She teaches at Princeton University. She's not there now because she's actually joining us from Iowa. And joining her tonight, speaking of Iowa, joining her tonight is Garth Greenwell. Garth is the author of Queerness and What Belongs to You, which won the British Book Award for Debut of the Year and was longlisted for the National Book Award. He was also the finalist for 6 other awards. So once again, we're not going through all these awards. Just suffice it to say, they're both stellar writers and presenters. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Garth's very capable hands. Thank you for joining us, you two.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Paula. Thank you for having us. Thank you to everyone in the audience for joining us tonight. It's such a pleasure and really an honor for me to get to talk with one of my very favorite writers, someone I really revere, Yiyun Li, about this beautiful book. And I wondered, Yiyun, if we could start maybe with you reading a little bit from the book for us.
Yes, and I just want to say I can't see the audience, so hello to all of you. And thank you, Garth, and thank you, Paula and Nick, for setting this up. And thank you, Garth, to be here with me. And I'm going to just start reading from the beginning. Very short excerpt, just so you can hear the sort of the voice of this novel. You cannot cut an apple with an apple. You cannot cut an orange with an orange. You can, if you have a knife, cut an apple or an orange, or slice open the underbelly of a fish, or if your hands are steady enough and the blade is sharp enough, sever an umbilical cord. You can slash a book. There are different ways to measure depths, but not many readers measure a book's depth with a knife, making a cut from the first page all the way down to the last. Why not, I wonder? You can hand a knife to another person, betting with yourself how deep a wound he or she is willing to inflict. You can be the inflictor of the wound. 1 half orange plus another half orange do not make a full orange again. And that is where my story begins. An orange that did not think itself good enough for a knife. An orange that never dreamed of turning itself into a knife. Cut and be cut. Neither interested me back then. My name is Agnes, but that is not important. You can go into an orchard with a list of names and write them on the oranges. Francoise and Pierre and Diane and Louise, But what difference does it make? What matters to an orange is its orangeness. The same with me. My name could have been Clementine or Odette or Henrietta. But so, an orange is just an orange. As a doll is a doll. Don't think that once you name a doll, it is different from other dolls. You can bathe it and clothe it and feed it empty air and put it to bed with the lullabies you imagine a mother should be singing to a baby. All the same, the doll, like all dolls, cannot even be called dead, as it was never alive. The name you should pay attention to in this story is Fabienne. Fabienne is not an orange or a knife or a singer of lullabies, but she can make herself into any one of those things. Well, she once could. She is dead now. The news of her death arrived in a letter from my mother, the last of my family still living in Saint Remy. Though my mother was not writing particularly to report the death, but the birth of her own first great-grandchild. Had I remained near her, she would have questioned why I had not given birth to a baby to be added to her collection of grandchildren. This is one good thing about living in America. I am too far away to be her concern. But long before my marriage, I stopped being her concern. My fame took care of that. America and fame, they are equally useful if you want freedom from your mother. Should I stop there?
Sure, thank you. Thank you so much. Well, before I turn to questions, I want to make sure that everyone who's watching knows that we'll save some time at the end of the talk for you guys, for questions from you guys, but please don't wait until then to ask your questions. Please go ahead and put them in the comments if you're joining us via YouTube as they occur to you. I'm looking forward to having more voices in the room than just mine asking Yiyun about this book. So last night, Yiyun, you did a wonderful event at the Center for Fiction with Rivka Galchen. And Rivka, at several points in the conversation, expressed a lot of anxiety about spoilers and about not spoiling the novel. Right. I have to say, I don't feel any of that anxiety, because it seems to me that this is really kind of an unspoilerable novel, in part because, like, in those first pages that you just read for us, I mean, basically, you tell us all the big events that are going to happen in the novel. We know that Fabienne is dead. We know that Agnes is no longer living in Saint-Remy. We know, the sort of, the stuff that one would read for in a different kind of novel has all been disclosed. It reminded me in that way, actually, of a book that is very different, although also set in France, which is Giovanni's Room, which also in the first two pages, like, discloses the whole story. I wanted to ask about that as a sort of opening strategy to kind of, so that one reads for not external event, but instead kind of the internal meaning of those events or something like that. Right.
I'm so glad you just mentioned Giovanni's Room. I've been teaching Giovanni's Room in the past 5 years, and you're absolutely right. The novel opens, Giovanni's Room opens with, I stand here in the house in South Africa, France, and Giovanni is going to be dead tomorrow morning. Well, I do believe, I think, I'm sure different writers do different things, but I do believe in, getting the big events out of the way, because I don't believe in plot, and I think I'm a very anti-plot writer. So I think if I worry about the plot, and then I have to worry about going from point A to point B, and eventually how Fabienne dies. And part of the reason I'm not interested in that, I think death is, I always say that to my students, death is not the end of story. Death is always the beginning of a story. And I feel that, not only this novel, many books, many novels I've worked on, they all open with a death, or death already happened, it's already a fact. And so, you know, it's not a surprise. I think in a way, I think Fabienne is already dead, and Agnes already estranged herself from her entire past, and she is living a life without a past. So I think it's always good to have, you know, that big thing out of the way when you start a novel. Yeah.
Well, I know that a question that you have gotten kind of boringly often about this book is like, what's happening? You're writing about France in the mid-century and these two young French girls. You know, a question I was going to ask you, but you answered it last night. You've often said that you write novels in order to have conversations with other writers. But you said last night that this novel, that wasn't true of this novel, and in fact, this novel isn't written in such a conversation.
Right.
And yet, I think I'm right, that maybe in an indirect way, a writer very beloved to you, Elizabeth Bowen, sort of led you to at least the territory or the circumstance of this novel. I wonder if you could talk a little bit just about the sources of this novel, of the aboutness of this
Aboutness. You know, I just wrote 5,000 words against aboutness in the Hoppers. Yeah, so I would say Elizabeth Bowen actually probably appears, or not appears, but it functions in multiple ways in this novel. You know, starting with the basic aboutness. I read this review in 1950s. Elizabeth Bowen reviewed 4 French prodigies, child authors. You know, I think the oldest was 16 maybe, and then there was a 14, and there was the youngest was 9-year-old girl poet. And I love Bowen. I mean, Bowen clearly did not think of highly of any one of these prodigies, and so her comments was, I think by then Francois Sagan was already famous, and she said, well, you know, the Friends, they're never short of prodigies, and these people make Sagan look like a middle-aged woman. And Sagan was 19 at the time, so I know. So in any case, so in the review there was this one French girl author, you know, 14-year-old from the French countryside. I was fascinated because I couldn't really find a lot about her, and there was just a snip of her having published a few books, you know, translated into English. She actually became quite an international sort of celebrity. I think Time magazine might have sent a photographer to photograph her in the French countryside. So, but you know, clearly she was forgotten, and anytime history forgets someone, I think that's a good time for the novelist to come in to say, you know, what is forgotten? Why is she forgotten? So I started to just make up this tale about this young French girl, but in my book they become a pair of French girls. Yeah, so that's sort of the basic aboutness of the novel, but the seed of the novel.
Right. You know, I've heard you talk a little bit about how your writing process has changed over the years, and how in your early books, this is an utterly terrifying idea to me, you sort of wrote everything in your head. You figured everything out so intensely that, like, you knew before you started writing that a story would fill up 14 pages. It was that intense. But that then more recently, you instead are writing and discovering things as you write, that you write without so much sort of planned out. And I want to ask 2 questions. One, I want to ask, you know, if that was the case with this novel as well, that like how much of it was planned and how much of it was improvisatory.
Right.
And then I want to ask whether this shift is connected to another big shift in your writing recently, which is you've talked about your embarrassment writing in English, which is a language in which the word I appears so frequently. And of course, your first 2 novels are written in a really very classic third-person narration. But then with Where Reasons End,
Right.
You wrote in the first person, and then Must I Go and this novel are all in the first person. So are those two things, the sort of improvisation and the first person narration, connected?
Yes, I think that's such a good question. And also, I just feel a little exposed. You asked that question. Well, I think the good thing is, the good thing is we do change, right? As a writer, as a person, things happen. We think more, we think differently. So, I like the fact that we can change, in a long career. You're right. And in my early, career, I would say maybe in my first 4 books, I think there was this desire to have some tight control of the material, whether it's how the stories were written or how the stories were told, what kind of voice, the structure. A lot of those things, I think, I would say were crafts, how you structure a novel, how you pace a novel, how you do transition, and even just to the point, as you said, I would say how long the story should be and where the transition is, where the climax is. A lot of those maneuvers, I think, are crafts oriented, and also I think there's a reason I did that, or one does that. There's a reason one does that, is you can feel that you're in control of the material. And I think the longer I write, the more I think there's no control. The stories decide how they would be told, and the novels decide how they will turn out to be. So this book, I think what you said, improvisation, it's exactly right. When I started this book, I did not know what happened. I knew the 2 girls right away. I had their voice in my head. I could not tell their day to day. I just had them speaking nonsense. How much I love making nonsense. And these girls loved making nonsense. So at the beginning of the sort of the first phase of the writing was basically 2 girls, teenagers, amusing themselves with all these nonsense. And as I wrote and I sort of got into the story, I got them down, and more characters came in. But I think there has to be a little bit of willingness to let go of the control. I think the longer I write, I realize the more I have to let go of the control to the characters and to the story. So the first draft was entirely exploratory, and which also meant the first draft was very rough, very messy. It was at least 150 pages longer than the current or than the final draft. And it took longer. Everything took longer, I think, in first draft, right? I don't know if you feel that. Everything takes longer in first draft, people just move slower, and then they move further in space. In the first draft, they move longer in time and in space. And I think revision is about control, putting a little bit back of the control into, just put the story and put the novel into a good shape. But going to your other question, I think that's probably the more interesting question, is switching from third person to first person. Well, I used to really hate first person. I could not, even if I wrote a first person narrator, you just started to feel itchy, and you started to feel an allergy to, it's just like, it's not comfortable. So I remember when I was in the workshop, Elisa McCracken said some writers are born first person narrators, some are not born first, some are just born third person. And I thought back then, I would always write in third person. But once again, life surprise you, careers surprise you. I think where reasons end, maybe even before that, dear friend, nonfiction, dear friend from my life, I write to you in your life, that is where that first person I started to come into my writing. And I often think sometimes I have 2 very useless words, right? Often, sometimes it's not precise, but I feel like each book we write, sort of each book we have written will make space for the future books. and I feel dear friend sort of made space, or that whether it's psychological space or emotional space for the first person narrators. So after Dear Friend, I felt I could write in first person. And in fact, the last 3 books were all in first person. And I felt quite comfortable. And I thought that was just a lovely surprise.
Sure. Well, and you know, Agnes is kind of a very peculiar first person narrator. She's a narrator who is so self-effacing. I mean, she feels that the entire value of her life comes from, or maybe it's more precise to say the value of her life resides in another person.
Right.
She refers, and this person is Fabienne, her friend. Agnes refers to herself as a shell. She says that she's empty as the air. And it seems to me that this, you know, there's the classic first person observer narrator. You know, you think of Great Gatsby, where like the big blazing presence is Gatsby. But Nick Carraway is not air. I mean, this seems more extreme than just a kind of observer narrator. And so I'm interested in that choice. And then to double up the question again, I'm interested in that choice, to have the narrator be so evacuated of self. And then this blazing presence of Fabienne, which is where sort of, you know, that's the fire of the book. So that choice of narrator, and then the choice, and again, I don't think this is a spoiler, but the choice halfway through the book to take Fabienne off stage. Right. So to put the burning center of the book, to take it away. Those seem to me, that I was so intrigued by those choices as a writer, because they seem to me kind of counterintuitive. Yeah.
That's exactly right. And I think counterintuitive is exactly right. And I seem to have this problem of just not making the novel easy to write. Because someone asked me, why didn't you have Fabienne as the narrator? You know, she was a very strong first person narrator. She has a strong personality. She's imaginative. She has all the vocabularies. But that's not interesting. I think she's so there's a reason I'm not interested in that. I think, you know, Fabienne, or that kind of first person narrator, as you said, you know, they have a very sort of clear self. They have a big presence in the book. And those narrators, I feel that, those characters, I feel they're very pure. They're very sharp. They can define everything easily. You know, Fabienne can define herself. Fabienne can define the world easily. But somehow I like Agnes, as you said, you know, she's self-effacing, but she's very muddy. There's a very interesting muddiness with her. I feel that maybe I feel drawn to muddy characters. You know, she calls herself a shell, but then at moments she will have disagreement with Fabienne. She'll have her own thoughts. She says she cannot do these things, but it turns out she actually can write quite well. So that kind of muddiness, I feel those characters have sort of depths. Well, the character like Fabienne, as you said, just brightness, you know, pure sun. But I want some muddiness from Agnes to carry the novel. So I think that's the reason I am more interested in Agnes. And then, of course, I think you're absolutely right. Halfway through the novel, Fabienne is gone. You know, again, I feel that because their friendship is so intense, they're just like a one body, right? In 2 girls. I could have just stayed with them forever. You know, even when I was writing it, I thought, you know, it would be nice if they just never part. They would stay together forever and ever, and would be a perfect world. I think that as a novelist, we never want the characters. We don't want to give the characters what they want. And we also don't want to give ourselves what we feel we must have. So in a way, to deprive Agnes is also to deprive myself of Fabian's presence. I just have to move Fabian a little off stage, and yet making sure she still is the biggest presence in the book. So I think that's just how it works, I guess. That's how I write.
Yeah. Well, another way in which Agnes is a curious narrator is that in part because this relationship between these two girls has such an intense gravity. I mean, it creates its own world.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's kind of glancing references to all of this interesting stuff happening outside this relationship that Agnes often, she doesn't look where one might expect her to look. She doesn't look to kind of the busiest part of the canvas.
Mm-hmm.
I'm struck, so we haven't said much about the background of the novel. It did seem to me that this is very much a novel written in the wake of World War II, that there's an extraordinary backdrop of violence and of death in this novel. Agnes's brother is dying after being imprisoned in a German labor camp. There seems to be some kind of epidemic going around. People are dying of fever. There are lots of new graves in the graveyard, which is where the girls hang out all the time, of course.
Yes.
Then there's this extraordinary story that is glanced at multiple times in the book, but never fully told, which is the story of Fabienne's sister, Jolene, who died in childbirth, as did her infant. Her infant was stillborn. And there's also this really haunting story of the father of that child, who is or was a Black American soldier. And after Jolene becomes pregnant, we're told he's court-martialed and executed. While Jolene is dying, there's this moment in the book that I feel like, there are several moments like this from this book, but I feel like I will be thinking about this moment forever. When Jolene is dying, Agnes and Fabienne go into the room. They're in the room and they touch the stillborn baby. And I just wanted to read at you a couple of your sentences where this is how Agnes remembers this. We felt old enough for everything in the world, including the stillborn baby, his color darker than our nanny goat Fleur. Fabienne and I both touched his head, sticky and gray and lukewarm, when all those women's attention was on Jolene, who was bleeding and dying quickly, making terrible noises. So that line, we felt old enough for everything in the world. If I've done the math right, they're like 7 or 8 years old. And I just wondered if you could talk about the effect of this backdrop, all of this violence, all of this death on their friendship, and then therefore also on the novel.
Right. Yes, I think, of course it's an essential part of the novel that they grew up in the countryside. They grew up, with farm animals, and people are dying and animals are butchered. Death is just everyday event. And that is I think looking from our 21st century, sheltered life, that seems a very harsh life. But that is their life. They would never think, oh, our life is so harsh, everybody is dying, or they would never think of, I think, we're old enough for everything is exactly how children that age would feel. And I think, I don't think any child would just say, I'm not old enough for that, shelter me, parents. Children always just go into life sort of with that blind willfulness, right? They just march towards life. They meet life, any life they meet, just with this blind willfulness. And I think that, if you think about Fabienne and Agnes, had they been, 21st century children, parents would interfere, right? Parents would make sure they would not go march into, battlefield like little lamb to be butchered. But, I think that was their time, 1950s. That was also, as you said, the reason their friendship is so complete, because they were just two little girl soldiers, not weapon, without any weapon, but not equipped to do anything, but with their imagination. I think all they have at that moment is their imagination, and their imagination sort of intertwined. Their two minds intertwined into one imagination, and they feel oddly immune to all the violence, all the death. They're not affected in that fundamental way. So I rather like that they're sort of their obliviousness, but also they're just matter of fact. Yes, there's a woman dies, sister is dying, and the baby is already dead, but still with a little bit warmness in the body. That's just how they, while you were reading that to me, I thought, well, there's a little bit of animalness with them. People do die like animals in the countryside, but children also live with that sort of animalness in them, and yet they're not animals, because they have their imagination, they have their articulation of their feelings, and they make up these things, games and worlds. So I admire them for that.
I realize that we haven't given much of a sense of sort of the story of the novel, which is that these two girls write together. Fabienne sort of composes and dictates a book, stories. Another thing that a very chilling moment, although really the chillingness of it I didn't feel it fully until my second time reading the book. So this publisher who's interested in publishing this book brings Agnes, because Fabienne decides that Agnes will be the sole author. She doesn't want to take credit because Agnes has a more kind of public face. She's a little prettier, she's a little better put together, a little better fed.
Right.
And the publisher tests Agnes because he's skeptical that she could have written this book.
Right.
And the very first thing that we see Agnes write herself, other than the book we're reading, which is Agnes's book, is a text about being in the first person, about being sexually assaulted by an American soldier. And that too was a moment, and again, also totally matter of fact, totally without affect, without any sense of fear or outrage. Right. But that, brings up the fact that you've chosen a particular moment in these girls' lives, which is a moment when they are sort of, I think Agnes is 13.
They're 13, yeah.
They're both 13. And so like right on the cusp of adolescence, on the cusp of sexuality, on the cusp of erotic feeling. And the first thing I heard about your book before I read it, Edmund White said to me two things about your novel. He said, one, it's as sad as life, which I think is very beautiful and true, although I also think it's very funny. And two, he said, it's a great lesbian love story. Now, last night, you said on stage with Rivka, you said that you feel that as a novelist, your talent is not writing love stories, but instead writing friendship stories. But I wanted to ask you, do you think Edmund is onto something? I mean, does that characterization, his response to this relationship, make sense to you?
Yes, I think I like that comments, as sad as life, and it is true, very sad. It's also as harsh as life, I feel. It's unkind as life. Yeah, when he first said, he said, you have written the great French lesbian love story. Just that, that's a very high praise from Edmund.
He would know. He speaks with authority.
I know. And I do think this is a love story. And towards the end, as you said, at the beginning, they were very much, pre-sexual. It's like two childhood friends who are so close, they make all these things. But while they are separated, one, Agnes is in the finishing school in England and Fabienne is home. I think it's a genius or sort of ingenious act of Fabienne to introduce a love triangle into those two girls relationship. As they started to write letters to each other, but Fabienne decides to introduce a boy, her own brother,
An imaginary brother, yeah.
Imaginary brother. So Fabienne is writing as a boy and as a girl to Agnes. And Agnes is simultaneously living in a love story with a boy and a love story with a girl. And I think by then they have began to sort of emerge into their almost like just budding sexual desire and confusion, right? Because Agnes thought, well, it's good if Fabian were a boy, I can love him. But Fabian later said, what does my brother have that I don't have other than he's a boy? Meaning you can love me as much as you can love him. Well, this imaginary brother serves as a love triangle. So yeah, and towards the end of the book, I always feel that wouldn't it be nice if they could just stay together forever? Then they would be a great love story. I think when Edmund said it's a great lesbian love story, is what they actually end up not having. I think he was talking about a future that they would never have. And it's also 1950s, this kind of love wasn't even just present in their life. They didn't even have language for that. They did kiss in the novel more than once.
They touched tongues, right? And then burst into laughter. Yeah.
Yes.
Which felt very true to queer childhood. And I also, there are all those lesbians in Paris. If they can just get to Paris, and Agnes says, let's go live together in Paris.
In Paris, yes.
And Agnes there they would have lots of examples.
I know.
Patricia Highsmith could show them how it's done.
I know. I feel like they have all these potential, but the problem is they don't have access to anyone or anything but themselves. Yes. Yeah.
Well, and I wanted to ask you, and you can, this may be an unanswerable question and you can also just ignore it, but I wanted to ask about queerness in your work more generally, because, actually I first learned about your work. I was living in Bulgaria. I was not writing fiction. I didn't really care about contemporary fiction.
Mm-hmm.
But I learned, that's not really true, but I learned about your work from a gay book blog. Yes, and it was for Gold Boy, Emerald Girl.
Oh.
And it is true that there are kind of extraordinarily deeply imagined queer lives throughout your work. Right. In both of your first two story collections, right. There are really remarkable and gorgeous stories about queer love.
Right.
And I wondered if there was anything you could say about that, and then I guess I am sort of Team Edmund in kind of reading also a possibility or an impossibility of that in this book as well. And I wondered if you could just talk about that, where that comes from, that sort of deep sympathy with your people.
Oh yeah, I love this because I didn't realize the moment you mentioned it, I thought, of course, in the Princess of Nebraska was about a gay boy impregnating a girl, and then there's a boy about a son as and then Gold Boy, Emerald Girl. I think, I said yesterday, and I keep saying this, I said, I'm not good at writing love stories. Maybe I should have said it more specifically. I don't think I'm good at writing straight love stories. I think maybe I am partly, well, I would say I am interested in, going back to Edith Bowen, she always described the best writing as the light was lid on. You don't take the lid off the story, keep the lid on. So the pressure is building and the tension is building. And what is the best story, love story with the lid on in the past, half century is queer love, especially, earlier work set in China. All the queer love, they all live with their lid on. Yeah. I think that might be one reason I felt very drawn to their stories was they have to maintain a facade, and even with kindness, there's a little bit of, the officer had this romantic love for the narrator, very but nothing said. Everything is just, as there was like a kind of stoicism with these characters, and particularly with the queer love, I think they have even more stoicism. I think that probably I've always been drawn to those characters who have to live with the lid on. And yeah, they have this deep passion. I'm just thinking, Gold Boy, Emerald Girl, for instance, the girl student's love for the professor is so deep that, it is a life-shattering kind of love, right? And life-changing too. And here, I think these two girls really probably have a little bit more potential than my Chinese characters. And yeah, but in the end, they lose each other.
Yeah. So I mean, I've said many times in many places how much I love your work and how important it has been to me, how beautiful I think it is, how much I admire its precision, how much I admire its fearlessness. I also want to confess, I don't know if I've ever said this to you before, I find it terrifying. And I wanted to think a little bit, and this book, thinking about this book helped me think a little bit about why I find it terrifying. Terrifying in the way that I think really great art often terrifies me. Mm-hmm. There's a moment where, there's a way in which I feel as though your characters often find themselves on the other side of something that I want to call humanness, kind of recognizable human response, the usual human needs. Mm-hmm. In this book, Agnes, observing her brother Jean as he dies, mm-hmm. she says this kind of incredible thing, thinking about her and about her family, her mother who desperately loves her son, right, and who is totally separated from him. Mm-hmm. And Agnes says, we, like the pigs in the sty and the sparrows on the windowsill and the crickets in the grass, were on the other side of where he was. Why would he care about how we felt? And then, almost immediately, she uses that, the separation between the dying and those on the side of life, to characterize her friendship with Fabienne. Mm-hmm. And she says, that summer, my family, my neighbors, my schoolmates, Monsieur Deveau, and all the people busy in the world were on the opposite side of where I was. Only Fabienne was on my side. Right. As I say, it seems to me that almost all your books explore people who are either by some crushing event pushed from the side of humanness to the other side, right, or are somehow always already on that other side. I think of in The Vagrants, Nini, right, and I think of Ruyu and Kinder Than Solitude. Yes. And it seems that to me that both Fabienne and to a lesser extent maybe, but also Agnes, mm-hmm. are kind of always already on this other side. Why are you drawn to that? Why are you drawn to sort of these lives that seem in so many ways to be excluded from the usual human comforts, the usual human fulfillments, the usual human needs? Right.
Oh my God. That makes me so, that's such an intense question. Sorry. And also, no, it's also it's an intense observation. I think you're right. There are usual human kindness, right? Human comfort and human needs. And one is I'm always aware of the limit of those things, and beyond the what we call usual humaneness, human kindness, human warmth. There's something out there sort of preying on these characters, or preying on us in life. And I do feel I'm drawn to the characters who have a little bit of this force to annihilate other people. But in doing so, they also annihilate themselves. And they have no fear in doing that. That's a very special kind of character, I think. You know, I don't think people, you know, if we look at the full range of human beings, not every human is like that. But there are a specific subset of human beings, the characters. They have that sort of almost, you know, one is they almost have a kind of phobia to human kindness. You know, I do think a subset of my characters have this phobia, but they also have this fearlessness because of the phobia. I think it's a very complex, you know, human condition. You know, sometimes I'm just thinking some of my characters, or maybe even Fabian and Agnes, you know, Fabian said, I want us to write a book so other people can know how it feels to be us. Of all the people in the world, Fabian wants people to know how it feels to be her. There's the deep desire to be known, to be felt. And yet she doesn't care about anyone, right? She puts up this, and she also functions as an annihilation of all human kindness. But I think it's that kind of struggle between this really deep desire to be known, to make connections with people, and this really deep desire to cut all connections. I think that kind of conflict is in a lot of people, probably in me too, or in a lot of people. But I think maybe that's my obsession in fiction. Now you said that, I think that's probably one of my obsessions in writing fiction.
Yeah.
Oh, I feel so I feel so seen. Oh, exposed. I feel exposed, Garth.
Oh, I'm sorry. That's the peril of making art, I guess. You know, so I have one last question, and then I'm going to turn it to readers' questions.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, you know, I am someone who feels very intensely the abyss that undergirds all human life.
Right.
And for that reason, I think there are certain kind of humanistic pieties that feel very dear to me, because they give me a reason to say yes to life.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been thinking a lot lately, and alongside and with and through your work,
Mm-hmm.
about affirmation, which we talk a lot about in art these days, and about art that is affirming.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I feel that the idea of art as affirmation expresses some real crucial value to me, that actually one of the most important ways in which art helps us to live is that art gives us a reason to say yes to life.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, so much of the art that is called affirming, that is praised for being affirming, feels to me like propaganda for life.
Right.
And so that question, and I guess it feels to me like propaganda for life, because very often in those kinds of narratives that are praised for that, which are very often narratives about lives that we sometimes think about as marginalized or as oppressed in various ways, they often seem to want to suggest that we live in a world in which nothing is irreparable. And that's what it means to be affirming. No matter what happens to us, we can overcome. That sort of nothing is finally unfixable. And actually, I think the affirmation that I need from art is art that firmly looks at the irreparable and still finds a way to say yes to life.
Right.
And I guess, when I read two of your books in particular,
Mhm.
Dear Friend from My Life, I Write to You in Your Life, and Where Reasons End,
Mhm.
I feel as though this is art that has just utterly fearlessly gone into the abyss.
Mhm.
And Where Reasons End, which is my favorite novel of the 21st century so far, I am such a proselytizer for that book. I tell everyone to read that book. And so many people have said to me, I can't read that book. It's too sad. I'll be destroyed by it. And I want to say to them, it's actually like the most affirmative book I know. Like in some way, it is the book I know that most says yes to life. But anyway, I've gotten off track. The question I wanted to ask you, and it's a question that actually Fabienne or Agnes thinking about Fabienne offers an answer to. I wanted to ask you, what is art for?
What is
And,
art?
because you are so pitiless in setting on fire a lot of the pieties that I swaddle myself in to avoid looking at the abyss. And that's something else that I find terrifying about your work. It's just utter sort of fearlessness, harshness in setting ablaze myths we tell ourselves about life.
Right.
And yet there is some really profound, I think, affirmative belief in art, in literature, in your work. Can you talk about that? What is literature for?
Oh, Garth. Propaganda for life. Can I just always quote you? Propaganda for life. There are enough propagandas for life. Well, you're so eloquent that I don't think I can answer you as eloquently as you just described my work, which is probably just the most eloquent description of my work. But I would say early on when I published, my earlier work, people would say, your work is so dark and bleak. It's too bleak. I feel like I developed this sort of allergy to the word bleak. I don't find my work bleak. And then back then, I never answered such, accusation of bleakness, but I thought, well, life is bleak, but what is bleaker is we make it less bleak in art, which is exactly what you said. It's a propaganda. If you make bleak life less bleak, that's the bleakest thing that would ever happen. So I don't find my work bleak. I probably said before, I feel that as an artist or as a writer, I just have a mirror. I write to reflect the world. That world is sometimes just merciless, right? That world is bleak. But I think the affirming part of it is, if I can have all the courage to reflect that world, if I have the courage and I can not only the courage, but I also have the art or the artfulness to capture that world. Isn't that more hopeful than anything else I can offer the world? I always think that way. I think that's the most hopeful thing. And going to Where Reasons End and Dear Friend, yes, I think the abyss is there. No matter how we work on, wrapping ourselves, there are moments in life we just have to be in that abyss. But I don't think that's even the end of the world. Or, I do think, I understand when people say Where Reasons End is so sad. I don't think that. I think that book is full of hope and light.
Yes.
And sparkled with some sort of lightness, and that's the kind of, I think that's the kind of work that I want to give people hope.
The last thing I'll say before taking at least a couple of these questions is, there's a moment in the novel, in the scene we've already discussed, where Fabienne puts her hands over Agnes's ears and screams. And Agnes thinks, if she had had a different kind of life, she could have made great novels. She could have made great symphony. She could have painted great paintings. That scream is this frustrated impulse to make art.
Mhm.
And that felt to me like one of the truest things I've ever read about sort of, I don't know why we do this thing. So thank you for that. Thank you for this book. And I'm so sorry, but Pedro is really insisting on saying hello. He's
Oh, hello.
very disruptive. So I apologize that my cat's gonna jump on screen. But so we have some really interesting questions. One of them, which is maybe a little lighter, is, without giving too much away, can you tell us why this title? Which is a good question that it didn't occur to me to ask.
I mean, it is a good, the Book of Goose, you know, the title existed before the novel existed. And somehow I feel the title was just there the whole time. I just wanted to write a Book of Goose. And of course, goose or geese, they're very interesting animals. They don't have good reputation, by the way. They're very annoying animals. They're aggressive. They attack people. They attack animals. But they are mysterious too. There's some sort of like inexplicableness with goose or with geese I'm always drawn to. And I keep saying I want to raise a pair of goslings, and nobody in my household wants that. They said, oh, geese are very aggressive animals. But there's some sort of life in them that I think I want to write a book to honor not only Agnes, but Goose. You know, Agnes is the ultimate goosey character, right? You know, she would be one of those characters people would say a silly goose. No, she's not silly at all. She has everything, you know, underneath. So that's why I give the book the title.
I love that. And then another kind of crafty question. So speaking of the historical setting of the novel, any tips that you use to make the reader feel connected, especially those who may not have enough knowledge of that period of history?
Right. No, I don't think you need to have any tips to read. You know, I don't think of the book as a historical novel because, you know, I think historical novels are a different set of novels. They have all the, you know, historical facts, you know, all the research. What I would like to think, you know, is Fabienne and Agnes would never think of their own lives as historical. They would not think of themselves as French girls living in the rural area post-World War II. They would not put their lives into a historical background. And as you said, you know, Garth, you said so eloquently, their life intersects with the bigger picture of post-World War II Europe. But they themselves don't think of their lives that way. And so I don't think of their lives that way, which is why, you know, the book is written from within them rather than from without. So then it's not really, you don't need to know much about the history. Once you read, you realize this is exactly what French countryside looks like in 1952.
Right.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Oh, there, I saw Paula.
Hi.
I am back, but man, you guys could have kept going on and on for another hour as far as I was concerned. Just fabulous conversation. It must be such a delight to have your #1 fan as your conversation partner. Thank you so much, Garth, for doing such a great job of shepherding this conversation. We really appreciate it. And this beautiful book, we actually have first edition copies at Book Passage, and we have book plates from Yiyun. So yeah, you can get a signed first edition, which is great for yourself, but also makes it a very special gift. So I highly recommend taking advantage. You can come into either of our stores in San Francisco or Corte Madera, or just call us up and place a phone order or go online. But we've got plenty of copies. and they're signed and they're first editions. And we're so grateful for this wonderful conversation. You didn't get to one of my comments and questions, but I just want to say, for those who maybe think that this is too heavy a book or too long or too whatever, it's none of that. It's beautiful. And they're short chapters. I love that they're these brief chapters that give it such a kind of flow and a clip to it that you're just easily fully engaged. But anyway, that aside, thank you both for doing this. We really appreciate it. Thank you to our audience for coming in now live or later in the archives. We love having these type of events. So until next time, thank you so much.
Thank you, Paula. Thank you, Nick. And Garth, you intimidated me with your intelligence.
Oh, stop you! Stop it!
I feel like exposed and slash and cut.
I'm sorry.
All right. Good night, everyone. Bye.